She was going to die a prisoner, until the cowboy looked at her with love instead of hate. The wooden walls of the small frontier jail were cold and unwelcoming. The floor, made of rough, splintered wood, creaked under the slightest weight, and the small window high up near the ceiling let in only a thin strip of sunlight. It was not enough to warm the space, nor to make the shadows retreat. In one corner of the cell, Clara sat on the hard, splintered bench, hugging her knees to her chest. She had lost track of time. Days and nights blurred together as the reality of her situation pressed down on her like a heavy, unshakable weight. Outside, the wind whistled through the town, carrying with it the voices of people who had long forgotten she existed, or perhaps had decided she didn't deserve to be remembered. Clara's story had begun long before she had ended up behind these cold bars. She had grown up in a small town on the edge of the frontier, where everyone knew everyone else. Life had been simple but hard. Her father worked as a carpenter. Her mother tended a tiny garden behind their modest home, and Clara had spent her childhood running barefoot across fields, chasing after her dreams with a stubborn determination that sometimes got her into trouble. She had always been curious, asking questions that adults found inconvenient, exploring places that were considered dangerous, and never allowing herself to accept things at face value. That curiosity, that desire to see the world beyond the boundaries set for her, was part of what had landed her here. She had been accused of a crime she didn't commit, a theft from the local general store. The evidence was circumstantial, mostly the result of misunderstandings and a few ill-timed coincidences, but in a town hungry for scandal, that had been enough. The sheriff, eager to prove he could keep order and maintain his reputation, had thrown her into the jail without waiting for a thorough investigation. The townspeople whispered and pointed fingers whenever they saw her, painting her in their minds as guilty long before a court could decide her fate. In the quiet hours of the morning, Clara would often press her face against the bars, staring out at the dusty street. She watched life move on outside while she remained trapped, her hands gripping the cold iron as though it could somehow give her strength. She saw women carrying baskets of bread, children chasing each other and laughing, men tipping their hats to neighbors as they passed. Life was happening beyond her reach, and yet, every day, she wondered if she would ever feel a part of it again. Fear and despair had become constant companions. Sometimes she felt that her heart was fading along with her hope, that the light of her dreams was slowly extinguishing behind these walls. And then there was Ethan. He was a figure she had noticed from the moment she was imprisoned, though she had never spoken to him. A tall man with a calm, steady presence, he rode past the jail every morning on his horse, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his face. His eyes, however, were different from everyone else in town. Where others looked with suspicion or outright contempt, his gaze was softer, more curious. There was no judgment in his look, only recognition. And over time, that recognition became a thread of hope for Clara. At first, it was only a fleeting glance, a nod as he passed by. But then he began to linger. He would stop at the edge of the street, tipping his hat in greeting, and sometimes, just sometimes, he would speak. A kind word, a simple question about how she was holding up, a small gesture of humanity in a place that had stripped her of it. Those brief interactions, though small, were lifelines. Clara realized that not everyone in the world was quick to hate, quick to judge. Some people still saw goodness, even when surrounded by the shadows of mistakes and misfortune. Days turned into weeks, and Clara began to anticipate his visits. She would straighten her posture when she saw him approaching, trying to make herself look less like the frightened girl the town believed her to be. And Ethan, in turn, would bring small comforts, a loaf of bread wrapped carefully in cloth, a jar of fresh water, even a small scrap of paper with a note that said nothing more than, "You are stronger than you know." To anyone else, it might have seemed insignificant, but to Clara, it was proof that someone cared, that someone believed she deserved more than her current fate. Their conversations, when they happened, were carefully measured. Ethan never overstepped the boundaries the law imposed, and Clara never allowed herself to expect too much. Still, through the small exchanges, a connection grew. Clara would tell him stories of her childhood, of fields of wildflowers she had once run through, of evenings spent under the stars with her family. And Ethan would listen, never interrupting, never dismissing her words but responding with gentle understanding. For the first time since her imprisonment, Clara felt a spark of hope that life could exist beyond the walls of her cell. The other prisoners, who had grown hardened by the harsh realities of frontier life, often mocked Clara's cautious optimism. They whispered that kindness was a lie, that no one could care for her, and that trusting anyone would only lead to betrayal. But Clara clung to Ethan's visits, to the idea that perhaps some people could see beyond labels, beyond fear and suspicion, to the person underneath. In a world that seemed determined to define her by a single accusation, Ethan's eyes reminded her that she was more than her mistakes or misfortunes. At night, when the jail grew silent except for the occasional creak of the building settling and the distant howl of a coyote, Clara would lie awake thinking about the world outside and the possibility of freedom, not just in the physical sense, but in her heart and mind. She imagined what it would be like to walk in the sunlight without fear, to feel the wind on her face, to hear laughter and know that she could be part of it again. And most of all, she imagined the look in Ethan's eyes, not one of anger or disdain, but of something that could only be called belief, respect, and maybe, if she allowed herself, love. The days were long and the nights were longer, but Clara began to understand something important. Even in the darkest circumstances, a single person's faith in you could ignite a light strong enough to burn through despair. Ethan's quiet presence, his careful gestures of kindness, and his unwavering respect were slowly changing something deep inside her. She was learning to hold her head a little higher, to breathe a little easier, to hope a little more boldly. In those quiet moments, Clara realized that survival was not only about enduring the physical confines of the jail, but also about nurturing the fragile flame of hope in her heart. And as she watched Ethan ride past each morning, she promised herself that she would not let that flame die. No matter how long her sentence, no matter how heavy the whispers of the town, she would hold on to the belief that someone could see her for who she truly was, and that perhaps, just perhaps, that vision could change everything. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Clara allowed herself to believe that she might not die a prisoner, not in the way that truly mattered. She might be behind bars, but her spirit could remain free, guided by the kindness and the quiet love of a man who had chosen to see her as more than her mistakes. And in the depths of that cold, lonely cell, Clara felt a flicker of hope that would grow stronger with each passing day, until the day it would carry her beyond the walls and into a life she had once thought impossible. The days that followed were not easy for Clara, but they were filled with moments that slowly stitched hope back into her heart. Ethan's visits became the rhythm of her mornings, a quiet thread connecting her to the world outside the jail walls. He never came in a hurry, never spoke more than necessary, but each gesture carried meaning. Sometimes it was a loaf of bread, warm from the oven. Other times it was a jar of fresh water or a small bundle of herbs that reminded Clara of her mother's garden. These small acts became more than sustenance. They were proof that someone cared, that she mattered, even when the town insisted she did not. Ethan had a way of seeing people that was rare and difficult to explain. He did not see Clara as a prisoner, or as someone to pity, or even as someone to judge. He saw her as a person, with dreams, fears, and stories that deserved to be heard. And in his eyes, Clara began to see herself again. The Clara who had laughed under the open sky, who had chased butterflies through fields, who had once imagined a life full of possibilities. That Clara had not vanished. She was buried under layers of fear and doubt, but Ethan's quiet recognition helped her uncover her own strength. Their conversations grew longer over time. At first they spoke of small things: the weather, the birds that perched near the jail, the sound of the wind through the trees. Then, as trust grew, they began to talk about life, about the past, about dreams that had been deferred or stolen. Clara spoke of her family, her childhood, and her love for the wide-open spaces beyond the town. Ethan listened with patience, never interrupting, never offering empty reassurances. His presence alone was enough to make her feel understood. One morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the small window of her cell, Clara noticed Ethan lingering longer than usual. He leaned against the post of the jail, watching her with eyes that seemed to measure her not for faults but for courage. "You've been quiet," he said gently, tipping his hat. "How are you holding up?" Clara hesitated. She had learned to guard her heart, to speak cautiously, but something in Ethan's tone allowed her to lower her walls, even if just a little. I'm managing," she admitted softly. "It's hard, but I'm trying," Ethan nodded. "That's all anyone can ask," he said. "Trying is enough. Even when the world seems to be against you, trying matters." Those words stayed with Clara long after he had left. She realized that hope was not about grand gestures or sudden miracles. Hope was small, steady, and quiet. It was in the way someone looked at you and saw your worth, even when everyone else turned away. Ethan's visits reminded her that even in the darkest times, small acts of kindness could illuminate the soul. The town around them, however, remained unforgiving. Rumors about Clara's guilt spread like wildfire. People whispered when she walked by, shaking their heads and muttering that she deserved her fate. The sheriff was strict, the jail cold, and the days seemed endless. And yet, Clara found herself looking forward to Ethan's visits more than anything else. They became her lifeline, a reason to endure the monotony and fear. One afternoon, as she sat on the hard bench, she noticed a small bundle of cloth pushed through the bars. Inside was a simple loaf of bread and a note, written in careful handwriting. "You are stronger than you realize. Keep going. I believe in you." Clara's hands trembled as she read the words. She had long forgotten what it felt like to be believed in, to have someone see her not as a prisoner but as a person. Tears came unbidden to her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of courage. Ethan's kindness was not limited to small gifts. He began to ask questions that made her think, questions that allowed her to reclaim her voice and her story. "What do you want, Clara?" he asked one morning. "If this were not happening, what would you be doing?" Clara paused. She had not considered her dreams in a long time. The prison had reduced her to survival, and survival left little room for dreaming. I used to want to travel," she admitted. "See the plains, visit my cousins in other towns, maybe even learn to paint." Ethan smiled softly. "Then you will. You just need to get through this first. And when that day comes, I'll be there to see you take that first step." His words were not promises of escape, they were promises of belief, and that belief mattered more than anything else. Clara realized that the world could take away her freedom, her comfort, and her security, but it could not take away the knowledge that someone saw her for who she truly was. The bond between them grew quietly, like a plant breaking through stone. There was no rushing, no dramatic declarations, only the steady presence of someone who refused to look at her with hatred or fear. Every day, Clara felt herself becoming stronger, not physically, but in the depths of her heart. She began to trust herself again, to trust that she could endure and that she could be more than the town's whispers. One evening, a new prisoner arrived, a man accused of cheating in a card game. He was loud, brash, and cruel, mocking Clara and trying to frighten her. The jail felt smaller, the air heavier. Clara felt fear creeping back into her chest, and for a moment she wondered if she had been foolish to let herself hope. But then she remembered Ethan. She remembered his eyes, his quiet patience, his unwavering belief that she was more than the sum of her circumstances. She straightened her back, took a deep breath, and faced the man with calmness she did not yet fully feel but that she was beginning to understand. She refused to let fear control her, because she had learned that strength was not about fighting others. It was about refusing to let the world take away your inner light. Ethan's visits continued, and with them came small lessons about life and trust. He would speak of his own experiences, the challenges of traveling across the frontier, the people he had met, and the lessons he had learned from kindness and hardship alike. Clara listened, absorbing his words, letting them become a map for her own journey through despair. She learned that even in a harsh world, goodness could exist, and that the smallest acts of courage, speaking your truth, protecting your dignity, helping another, could change the course of a life. The more Clara learned, the more she realized that freedom was not only a physical state, but also a mental and emotional one. Even trapped behind bars, she could find moments of peace, joy, and self-respect. She began to imagine herself beyond the jail, walking freely under the sun, feeling the wind in her hair, laughing again without fear. And she pictured Ethan beside her, not as a savior, but as a companion, someone who had taught her the value of seeing goodness even in the smallest gestures. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between them deepened into something neither of them could fully name yet. Clara began to trust not just Ethan, but herself. She realized that she had the strength to endure, to survive, and perhaps one day to reclaim her life fully. The jail, once a place of despair, had become a place of quiet learning, a place where she rediscovered courage and hope in the presence of someone who refused to hate. Clara no longer counted the days in the jail with fear. Instead, she counted them with anticipation, waiting for Ethan's visits, cherishing each word, each gesture, each smile. In those moments, she was no longer a prisoner in the full sense. She was a young woman learning to believe in herself again, guided by the simple, quiet love of a man who saw her as more than her circumstances. By the end of the second month, Clara could feel a subtle but undeniable change in herself. She held her head higher, walked with a little more confidence within the narrow confines of her cell, and spoke with a steadier voice. The hope Ethan had nurtured was now hers as well, a flame that refused to be extinguished, no matter how cold or dark the world outside, or inside, might be. And so the days continued, each one a mixture of hardship and hope. The town outside might still whisper and judge, but within the walls of that small jail, Clara had begun to live again. She had begun to believe that life, even in the harshest conditions, could still offer kindness, understanding, and the quiet beginnings of love. And she knew, deep in her heart, that this bond, this trust, might be the very thing that would one day set her free. Life inside the small frontier jail continued, but the quiet rhythm that Clara had found was beginning to shift. The townspeople were talking more than ever about her, and the whispers were growing louder with each passing day. Rumors traveled faster than the wind, and every rumor twisted the truth just a little more. Some claimed she had stolen from the general store. Others said she had hidden secret letters from influential men. Nothing was certain, but the town had decided she was guilty, and in a small place where everyone knew each other, the opinion of the many often outweighed the truth of one. Clara could feel the weight of the town's judgment pressing against her, heavier than the iron bars of her cell. She watched from her window as neighbors exchanged glances, shook their heads, and muttered under their breath. Sometimes she caught children pointing at her when they thought she wasn't looking. Every glance, every whisper reminded her that she was a prisoner not only of the jail, but also of the town's opinions. The cold stone and wooden walls were nothing compared to the cold eyes of the people who had already decided she was unworthy. But amid the harshness, there was a light. Ethan continued his visits, arriving each morning with quiet patience and careful attention. He never allowed the town's judgment to reach her. His presence alone was enough to remind Clara that not everyone saw her as guilty. He spoke to her about ordinary things, about his travels, about the way the sunlight felt on the plains at dawn, about the birds and animals he had seen along the way. Each story was simple, yet filled with life, and each moment with him reminded Clara of a world outside her confinement, a world where she might belong again. One morning, Ethan arrived with an unusual expression on his face. He leaned against the jail post, his eyes scanning the street, and then looked directly at Clara. "There are people in town who are starting to talk about me," he said. "Some of them are saying that I shouldn't be visiting you. They think I'm helping someone who doesn't deserve it." Clara's heart sank at the thought. She knew the town was quick to judge, and she feared that their scrutiny might push Ethan away. But instead of retreating, Ethan continued, "I don't care what they say. You're human, Clara. You've done nothing to deserve their hatred, and I won't let their words stop me from seeing you for who you are." His words filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in weeks. In that moment, she realized that Ethan was different from everyone else in town. He was not swayed by gossip or by fear of what others might think. He saw her as a person, a human being with value, and he refused to let the town's judgment cloud that vision. That belief gave Clara strength. It reminded her that there was still good in the world, even when everything around her suggested otherwise. The days following that conversation were not easy. Townspeople began to notice Ethan's presence more. Some were curious, others suspicious, and a few openly hostile. The general store owner, who had initially accused Clara, muttered bitterly as Ethan rode past on his horse. "Why do you waste your time on her?" he asked a neighbor. "She's guilty, and you know it." Ethan only tipped his hat and rode on, but Clara could see the tension in the street whenever he appeared. She worried that the attention might eventually reach the sheriff, or that someone might try to harm her or Ethan. Yet every time he came to her, he brought calmness and reassurance. He never let the outside world invade the small space they shared during those visits. Each interaction became a sanctuary, a brief moment where judgment, fear, and suspicion could not touch them. Clara also noticed how the other prisoners reacted to Ethan's visits. Some were skeptical, questioning why he would bother with someone accused of a crime. Others watched quietly, perhaps envious of the attention, but no one could deny that something had changed in Clara. She carried herself differently now, her posture stronger, her eyes brighter. She spoke with more confidence and met challenges with a steadier heart. The belief that Ethan placed in her had become a mirror, allowing her to see her own strength for the first time in a long while. One afternoon, as Clara sat on her bench, she noticed a group of women gathering near the edge of the street. They were whispering and pointing at the jail, clearly discussing her. Clara felt her chest tighten with anxiety. She had grown accustomed to the isolation, to the small, controlled world she had created for herself inside the jail. But now the world outside seemed louder, harsher, and unyielding. Ethan arrived shortly after, noticing the gathering crowd. He dismounted his horse with ease and approached her cell, his calm presence a shield against the whispers and stares. "Don't worry about them," he said softly. "They don't know your story. They only know what they want to believe. You don't have to prove anything to anyone but yourself." Clara felt a surge of gratitude and relief. In Ethan's presence, the gossiping voices faded into the background, becoming meaningless. She realized that the only opinion that truly mattered was her own, and Ethan's gentle encouragement reminded her that she could choose to define herself, rather than allowing the town to define her. Despite the tension outside, Clara found herself opening up more to Ethan. She shared stories of her dreams, her fears, and the things she had long kept to herself. She spoke of the small joys she remembered from childhood, the feel of the grass beneath her feet, the laughter of her friends, the songs her mother used to sing. Each story allowed her to reconnect with her own humanity, and each time Ethan listened, he treated her words with care, never dismissing them or making her feel small. Ethan's encouragement became a catalyst for Clara's inner transformation. She began to write in a small notebook he had brought her, recording her thoughts, dreams, and memories. Writing allowed her to organize her feelings, to reflect on her experiences, and to reclaim her voice. With each passing day, she felt less like a prisoner and more like a young woman reclaiming her own identity. But the town's judgment was never far away. The whispers grew louder, and the suspicion that Clara and Ethan shared something more than friendship began to circulate. Some people warned Ethan to stay away, insisting that anyone who associated with Clara would be tainted by her supposed guilt. Others tried to humiliate Clara, bringing small accusations or reminders of her imprisonment. The walls of the jail, though strong, could not block the harshness of human judgment. Yet, each time Clara faced these challenges, Ethan's quiet confidence gave her courage. He reminded her that their lives were their own, that the opinions of others could not dictate her worth or her future. He encouraged her to stay true to herself, to hold on to the goodness within her, and to believe that justice, eventually, could prevail. Over time, Clara began to notice small changes in the town as well. A few people who had once joined in the whispers began to watch her with curiosity instead of contempt. Perhaps it was Ethan's unwavering support, or perhaps it was the way Clara carried herself despite the hardships she endured. Whatever the reason, some townspeople began to see her differently, not necessarily as innocent, but as strong, resilient, and capable of dignity even in the face of injustice. One evening, after Ethan had left for the day, Clara sat by the small window, looking out at the town as the sun set behind the hills. The orange and pink hues painted the sky, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond the jail. She saw herself walking freely through the streets, laughing with friends, and feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. She pictured Ethan riding beside her, not as a savior, but as a companion who had helped her believe in herself again. The bond between them had grown stronger than either of them could have anticipated. What began as simple acts of kindness and quiet conversations had evolved into a deep connection built on trust, respect, and shared understanding. Clara realized that love could exist even in the harshest circumstances, not the fiery, dramatic love of stories, but a steady, patient, and unwavering love that gave her the courage to endure and to hope. As the days passed, Clara felt a sense of empowerment she had never known before. She understood that while she could not control the town's opinions or the actions of those in power, she could control her own heart, her own actions, and her own responses. With Ethan's guidance and support, she learned that true strength was not about confrontation or rebellion, but about maintaining dignity, staying true to oneself, and nurturing hope even when surrounded by fear. By the end of the third month, Clara had transformed in ways the town could not yet see. Inside the jail, she had found a sense of freedom that was deeper than the absence of physical confinement. She had discovered courage, resilience, and the beginnings of a life guided by hope rather than despair. And she knew that the bond she shared with Ethan would be the foundation upon which she would build her future, a future where judgment could not dictate her worth, and where love, trust, and understanding could light the path forward. Even as the town continued to murmur and watch, Clara felt a quiet confidence growing inside her. She no longer feared their opinions as she once had. Instead, she focused on what truly mattered: her own growth, her own hope, and the knowledge that someone, a person of integrity and kindness, believed in her. And that belief, more than anything else, gave her the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The days in the small frontier town continued with their usual rhythm, but for Clara, life inside the jail was growing increasingly tense. The town's whispers had become more than just background noise. They were warnings, sharp and pointed, reminding her that the world outside would not be gentle. She could feel eyes on her every time someone passed, judging her for something she had never done. Fear had a way of creeping in, but alongside it grew a quiet determination. Clara knew that she could no longer rely solely on hope and kind words to carry her forward. She needed action, and thankfully, she was not alone. Ethan had noticed the increasing hostility as well. The whispers, the suspicious glances, and the town's growing resentment toward him for visiting Clara had all begun to create a dangerous environment. He could see it in the sheriff's eyes when he passed, in the sharp words of the store owners, and in the cautious glances of the townspeople. If something was not done soon, Clara could be trapped not just by the jail, but by the growing tide of judgment and fear. Ethan understood that kindness alone would not be enough to protect her. It was time to act. He began to plan carefully, considering every possible way to ensure her safety. He could not simply break her out. That would bring more trouble than it solved. But he could use his knowledge of the town and the surrounding land to create opportunities for her protection and eventual freedom. Ethan studied the comings and goings of the sheriff, noted the routines of the jail, and quietly observed the town's defenses. Every detail mattered. He knew that even a single mistake could put Clara in more danger than she already faced. Ethan's careful planning was not done in secret alone. He began to speak with a few trustworthy allies, people who had once been outsiders in the town but who understood the need for justice. These were men and women who had seen wrongdoing and had refused to turn away. They knew that the town's judgment was harsh, and they respected Ethan's integrity. Together, they devised small steps that could give Clara a chance to regain her freedom safely without endangering her further. It was a delicate balance, requiring patience, timing, and trust. Meanwhile, Clara noticed changes in Ethan's demeanor during his visits. There was a quiet urgency behind his calm presence, a subtle determination that had not been there before. He spoke less about trivial things and more about careful plans, about opportunities to reclaim her life. Clara could sense that something was shifting. She felt a mixture of excitement and fear. Excitement because the possibility of freedom seemed closer than ever, and fear because she understood the risks involved. But despite the uncertainty, she trusted Ethan completely. He had proven time and again that he saw her as more than a prisoner, that he valued her life, her dignity, and her future. One evening, after the sun had begun to set and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Ethan arrived with a small bundle of supplies. Inside were food, water, and a map of the surrounding area. He leaned against the jail post, his eyes serious but reassuring. "Clara," he said softly, "we have a chance to make things right. It won't be easy, but it's possible. You have to trust me, and I need you to stay calm no matter what happens." Clara felt her heart race. The thought of leaving the jail, of stepping into the unknown, was both terrifying and thrilling. She nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. "I trust you," she said. "I know you wouldn't put me in danger." Ethan smiled faintly, a mix of relief and determination in his eyes. "Then we'll do this carefully, step by step. We'll move when the time is right, and we'll make sure that no harm comes to you." The next few days were filled with preparation. Ethan and his allies quietly moved supplies, scouted escape routes, and observed the town's routines. Clara spent her time learning the routes, memorizing every detail of the plan, and preparing herself mentally for what lay ahead. She realized that freedom was not something that happened instantly. It was something that had to be earned through courage, patience, and careful action. During these moments, their bond deepened in ways neither of them had anticipated. While planning for her freedom, they shared small moments of laughter, quiet conversation, and even vulnerability. Clara spoke of her fears, admitting how easily she had once given up hope, and Ethan shared his own experiences, telling her about times he had faced danger and uncertainty. These moments strengthened their trust, creating a connection that went beyond words or gestures. It was a bond built on shared purpose and mutual respect, a bond that would carry them through the challenges ahead. Finally, the day of action arrived. The morning was calm, almost serene, with a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the few trees scattered around the town. Clara could feel her nerves tightening, but she also felt a sense of readiness she had never known before. Every step of the plan had been rehearsed in her mind, every potential obstacle considered. She was ready to reclaim her life. Ethan appeared outside the jail at the appointed time, his horse saddled and waiting. He helped her prepare, checking that she had everything she would need, a small satchel of food, water, and her precious notebook. He spoke to her quietly, offering reassurance and encouragement. "Remember, Clara, this is just the beginning," he said. "We move carefully, we stay calm, and we trust each other. You're stronger than you think." With that, they began their carefully orchestrated movements. Every step was deliberate, every glance calculated to avoid the sheriff and the watchful eyes of the townspeople. Clara felt her heart pounding in her chest, but she also felt an exhilaration she had never experienced. The world outside the jail, once so frightening, now seemed filled with possibility. She was no longer simply surviving, she was acting, reclaiming her life one careful step at a time. As they moved through the town and into the surrounding countryside, Clara could feel the weight of fear lifting. The wide-open spaces reminded her of her childhood, of fields of wildflowers, sunsets over distant hills, and the endless sky above. Each step she took was a step toward freedom, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. She felt a sense of empowerment that came from taking control of her destiny, from moving beyond the walls that had once confined her in every sense. Ethan guided her with calm expertise, leading her along trails that were familiar to him but unknown to most. They paused only briefly, resting in the shade of trees and sharing quiet moments of conversation. Clara realized that freedom was more than escape. It was about reclaiming her spirit, learning to trust again, and allowing herself to hope for a future that had once seemed impossible. By the end of the day, they had reached a safe location, far enough from the town to avoid immediate pursuit. Clara collapsed onto the ground, exhausted but exhilarated. The fear that had once defined her life was replaced by a new energy, a sense of possibility, hope, and determination. She looked at Ethan, who smiled gently, pride and relief in his eyes. "You did it," he said softly. "You made it this far and we're just getting started." Clara realized in that moment that her journey was no longer about surviving imprisonment. It was about embracing life fully, about learning to trust, to hope, and to love. Ethan had shown her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. He had helped her discover strength within herself that she had not known existed, and in doing so, he had transformed her world completely. As the sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows across the fields, Clara felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had been a prisoner in more ways than one, trapped not only by iron bars but by fear, doubt, and the judgment of others. Now, with Ethan by her side, she felt free in ways that went beyond the physical. She had reclaimed her life, her spirit, and her hope. And for the first time in a long while, she could imagine a future filled with possibilities, a future she would face not as a victim, but as a young woman capable of shaping her own destiny. The night fell gently around them, and Clara and Ethan sat together, looking out over the quiet landscape. They did not speak much, for words were not necessary. In that silence, there was understanding, trust, and a shared vision of the life that lay ahead. Clara knew that challenges would still come, that the town and its whispers were not gone. But she also knew that with courage, planning, and the support of someone who truly believed in her, she could face whatever came next. And so, in the quiet of the night, Clara allowed herself to dream again, to imagine a life beyond fear, beyond suspicion, and beyond the jail that had once defined her existence. With Ethan by her side, she felt ready to embrace that life, step by step, day by day, toward a future filled with hope, love, and freedom. The morning sun rose slowly over the hills, casting golden light across the fields and bathing the land in warmth. Clara stood beside Ethan, feeling the cool breeze on her face and the soft rustle of grass beneath her feet. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe freely, unburdened by the weight of bars or whispers. The world around her was vast and open, full of possibilities she had only ever dreamed of while trapped inside the cold walls of the jail. With Ethan by her side, she felt a sense of freedom that reached deep into her soul. The journey back to the town was deliberate and careful. Clara and Ethan knew that the town would still be watching, that suspicion and judgment lingered like a shadow over every familiar street. But Clara had changed. She was no longer the frightened, uncertain girl who had first arrived at the jail. She carried herself with quiet strength, her heart guided by hope and the belief that she had the right to live her life on her own terms. As they approached the outskirts of the town, Clara noticed that some of the townspeople had begun to whisper among themselves, their eyes following her cautiously. There was curiosity in their glances now, rather than outright hostility. A few faces softened as they realized she was not running away, not hiding, but walking with dignity and purpose. She understood that the journey to freedom was not only about escaping the physical jail, but also about confronting the invisible chains of fear, judgment, and doubt that had bound her for so long. Ethan stayed close, offering reassurance with gentle words and steady presence. "Remember, Clara," he said softly, "you've already proven your strength. Whatever they think, whatever they say, it doesn't change who you are. You've faced fear and come through it stronger than ever." Clara nodded, letting his words sink into her heart. She felt the truth in them, the reality of her own courage and resilience. She had endured more than most could imagine, and she had not only survived but grown. Every act of kindness from Ethan, every careful plan and shared moment of trust had led her to this point. She realized that freedom was more than physical. It was a state of mind, a reclaiming of her spirit, her confidence, and her sense of self. As they walked through the town, some people could not help but notice the change in her. Clara carried herself with quiet dignity, her eyes steady and clear. The fear that had once defined her gaze was gone, replaced by a calm determination. Children who had once pointed and whispered now looked with curiosity, some even offering tentative smiles. Adults who had been suspicious began to nod in acknowledgement, sensing that she was no longer defined by the accusations of the past. Despite this subtle shift, not everyone was ready to accept her return. A few townspeople still muttered under their breath, their whispers sharp and critical. But Clara had learned to face judgment without letting it control her. She understood that not everyone would understand her journey, that some hearts were too closed to see beyond fear and rumor. And that was acceptable. What mattered was that she had the freedom to live her life, to choose her path, and to embrace hope and happiness once more. Ethan led her to a quiet spot just outside the town, a place where the hills rolled gently and the grass swayed in the wind. It was a place where they could pause and breathe without fear, where the sounds of the town faded into the background, leaving only the peaceful rhythm of nature. Clara sat down on a soft patch of grass, her heart overflowing with relief and gratitude. For the first time, she could reflect on everything that had brought her to this moment, the pain, the fear, the loneliness, and above all, the kindness and unwavering support of Ethan. "I don't know how to thank you," Clara said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "You've saved me in more ways than I can count, not just from the jail but from losing myself." Ethan smiled gently. "You didn't need saving, Clara. You had the strength all along. I just helped you see it." Clara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had spent so long believing that her worth was defined by others, that her life was something fragile and powerless. But now, she understood that true strength came from within. It came from hope, courage, and the willingness to act even when fear tried to hold you back. And it came from the people who see that strength and nurture it, who refuse to let judgment or hate define you. Ethan had been that person for her. The two of them spent hours in quiet conversation, sharing their thoughts, dreams, and reflections on the journey they had just completed. Clara spoke of the life she wanted to build, a life filled with freedom, learning, and new experiences. She spoke of the people she wanted to reconnect with and the places she hoped to visit. Ethan listened, encouraging her and offering gentle guidance, helping her imagine the future she deserved. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Clara realized that this was the beginning of a new chapter. She was no longer defined by her past, no longer bound by fear or suspicion. She had reclaimed her life, step by step, guided by courage and supported by someone who had believed in her when the world had not. The journey had not been easy, but it had transformed her in ways she could not have imagined. Ethan and Clara began to make plans for the days ahead. They discussed moving beyond the town temporarily, finding a place where they could live safely while Clara's name was cleared and her reputation restored. They spoke of learning new skills, helping others who were struggling, and building a life together founded on trust, respect, and love. Each plan, each dream, was a step toward freedom not just from the town, but from the lingering fear that had once controlled her life. As night fell and the stars appeared one by one in the clear sky, Clara felt a deep sense of peace. She had endured fear, injustice, and isolation, yet she had emerged stronger and more resilient. She had learned the value of kindness, the power of hope, and the importance of trust. Most importantly, she had learned to see herself as capable, worthy, and deserving of love and happiness. Ethan's presence beside her was a constant reminder of what could be achieved through patience, care, and unwavering belief in another person. He had not only guided her to physical freedom, but had helped her reclaim her spirit, her confidence, and her hope. The bond they shared was now unbreakable, built on shared experiences, mutual respect, and quiet love that had grown steadily, even in the harshest of circumstances. In the following days, Clara began to take steps toward rebuilding her life. She visited a few townspeople cautiously, explaining her side of the story and seeking to clear misunderstandings. Many were surprised to see her calm and composed, her dignity intact despite the trials she had endured. Slowly, some hearts began to open and respect replaced suspicion. Others remained unconvinced, but Clara understood that not everyone would change. What mattered was that she had reclaimed her freedom, her voice, and her sense of self. The journey was not without challenges. There were moments when doubt crept in, when the memories of the jail and the harsh whispers threatened to overshadow her progress. But each time, she found strength in Ethan's support and in the knowledge that she had already overcome far greater obstacles. She reminded herself daily that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward despite it. As the weeks passed, Clara and Ethan began to explore the countryside, discovering new places, meeting kind strangers, and experiencing the beauty of life beyond confinement. They rode horses across open plains, walked through fields of wildflowers, and watched sunsets that stretched endlessly across the horizon. Each experience reminded Clara of the vastness of the world and the limitless possibilities that awaited her. Through it all, their bond deepened further. Clara learned to trust not only Ethan but herself, to make decisions, to face challenges, and to embrace opportunities with confidence. She realized that freedom was not just about leaving the jail behind. It was about reclaiming her spirit, her courage, and her right to live fully and authentically. One evening, as they sat atop a hill overlooking the town they had once left behind, Clara turned to Ethan. "I never imagined life could feel like this," she said softly, "so full of hope and yet so real." Ethan smiled, his eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "Life has always been full of possibilities, Clara. Sometimes we just need someone to help us see them." Clara took a deep breath, feeling the wind on her face and the warmth of the sun fading into night. She realized that she had come a long way, from the frightened girl in the jail to a strong, hopeful young woman ready to embrace the world. And she knew that with courage, trust, and the support of someone who truly believed in her, she could face anything. The stars twinkled above, silent witnesses to her transformation. Clara knew that challenges would continue, that the town and its whispers might still linger, but she no longer feared them. She had freedom in her heart, strength in her spirit, and love beside her. The future was uncertain, yes, but it was hers to shape, filled with endless possibilities and the promise of a life lived fully. As the night grew quiet, Clara and Ethan sat together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next. They had journeyed through fear, uncertainty, and judgment, and emerged stronger, wiser, and united. The story of Clara's imprisonment and escape had ended, but the story of her life, her freedom, her courage, and her love, was only just beginning. And in that moment, beneath the endless sky, Clara allowed herself to truly believe. She was free, she was loved, and she was ready for a future she had once thought impossible.